Hey guys, for today's video, I'll be analyzing Silverwolf's kits, relics, ornaments, Lightcones, teams, and Eidolons to help you reach your full potential. Starting off with her kit, her skill deals quantum damage equal to 196% of Silverwolf's attack to the target, and has a 120% base chance to implant one weakness of an on-field ally target's type to one designated enemy target, prioritizing the implant of a weakness that matches the first character in the team lineup. This means that as long as your carry is the first character in your team lineup, you will always be able to implant their weakness onto the enemy, unlike before she got the buff. The skill also reduces the enemy target's resistance to that weakness type by 20% for 3 turns, but if the enemy target already has that type of weakness, the resistance reduction effect to that type will not be triggered, meaning that you can't just stack the rest reduction with the skill, since it won't let you further reduce resistances by breaking the enemy on top of adding the rest reduction. So this part of her skill is really only here to give you that resistance reduction without having to break the enemy first, which will be a pretty big boost to your DPS since you won't have to spend time breaking the enemy before you can do that extra damage. Her skill also states that each enemy target can only have one weakness implanted by Silverwolf, and that when she implants another weakness to the target, only the most recent implanted weakness will be retained, meaning that she isn't like an Axa in the sense that you can implant every weakness onto an enemy. Her skill also states that in addition, there is a 100% base chance to further reduce the target's all-type res by 13% for 2 turns, which does stack with her previous res reduction and will be helpful for sub DPS damage from characters like Hyacine or even her own sub DPS damage. For her ultimate, it states that she deals quantum damage equal to 380% of Silverwolf's attack to all enemies, which are pretty good multipliers for a support, especially because the ultimate targets all enemies. It also states that it has a 120% base chance to reduce the defense of all enemies by 45% for 3 turns. This amount of defense shred is actually a massive amount that'll make it far easier to reach 100% defense shred with other sources of defense shred, which is really important because you want to maximize the amount of defense shred you apply to an enemy, since defense shred provides accelerated returns. For example, 45% defense shred only gives you around 26% more damage, while 100% defense shred will give you 110% more damage, meaning that if possible, you'll want to combine Silverwolf with other characters that can also reduce defense. For her talent, it states that Silverwolf can create 3 types of bugs that can either reduce attack by 10%, reduce defense by 12%, or reduce speed by 6%, which is pretty good since you have a 33% chance to further reduce the enemy's defense, which again is really important for your damage. It also states that after every attack launched by Silverwolf, she has a 100% base chance to implant one random bug that lasts for 3 turns in the attacked enemy target. It also states that when the enemy target gets defeated, the weakness Silverwolf implanted will be transferred to another surviving enemy on the field that hasn't been implanted with that weakness by Silverwolf, prioritizing targets at elite level and above, which is really good because this fixes an inherent flaw that most debuffs have, that being that debuffs, and thus your extra damage, disappears after you already defeated an enemy, which is pretty good because that means that you won't be having to spam her skills to reapply that weakness. For her passive, it states that the duration of a bug is extended by 1 turn, and every time an enemy's weakness gets broken, Silverwolf has a 100% base chance of implanting a random bug on that target, which is really good since this extra bug application makes it so that the 30% chance for the defense reduction bug isn't so bad anymore, since you can just spam bugs until you get it. For her other passive, it states that when the battle starts, she immediately regenerates 20 energy, which is really good since it'll let you have her defense shred up for pretty much the entire time, since it lasts for 3 turns. It also states that when Silverwolf's turn starts, she regenerates 5 energy, which will help even more for her ultimate uptime. For her other passive, it states that for every 10% effect hit rate that Silverwolf has, additionally increases her attack by 10% up to a max of 50%, which is just a boost to her sub DPS since you already want 67% effect hit rate. Anyways, how do you actually apply all of this information? Well, all you're gonna wanna do is slap your main DPS onto the first slot of your team, then use your ultimate as much as possible to maintain the defense shred and do some nice sub DPS. Also, try to use your skill only when you need to reset the resistance reduction and the all-type res reduction, since her skill doesn't really do anything other than give her more energy, which typically isn't worth the skill points since she already has good enough ultimate uptime. For her required stats, she's gonna want 67% effect hit rates, 160 speed but 170 speed with Cypher's Lightcone, and 135 speed for an E1 DPS Silverwolf, and a nice 1 to 2 crit rate to crit damage ratio. After you got that, you're gonna want to fill her up with a ton of attack to increase increase her ultimate sub DPS. For her relics, she's gonna want the Eco set since it advances her forward by 25% when she uses her ultimate, which will help her regen more energy so that she can increase her ultimate uptime, and thus her defense shred uptime and her sub DPS. For an alternative, you can use a mixture of 2-piece bonuses that provide speed, like the Sacerdo set or the Messenger set. Now if you want to focus on her sub DPS, which I would only recommend doing if she's E1, you can run her with either the Pioneer Diver of Dead Water sets, since it increases her damage dealt to debuffed enemies, or the Genius set, which gives her quantum damage bonus and lets her ignore 10% defense and 10% more defense against enemies with a quantum weakness, which should result in around 25% more personal damage if she doesn't have any other sources of defense shred on top of that. You can also use the Scholar set since it'll increase her skill and ultimate damage. For her planar ornaments, you're gonna want to use the Lushaka set since it'll increase the attack of the character in the first slot of your team, which should already be your main DPS since you want to implant her weakness. It'll also increase her energy recharge rate by 5%, which is really good for her ultimate uptime. For an alternative, you can use the Penaconi set since it offers 5% ERR as well, while providing 10% quantum damage dealt to all allies rather than 12% attack to your main DPS, which will really only be viable in quantum teams or teams with a quantum main DPS. For another option, the Sprightly set would also be good since it gives her 5% ERR as well and advances her forward by 40% if her speed is above 120 at the start of battle, which synergizes really well with the extra energy she gets at the start of battle and will be really helpful for her ultimate uptime. Now if you want to focus on her sub DPS, which again I would only recommend doing if she's at E1, then running her with the Salsoto set would be good because it provides crit rate and 15% ultimate damage bonus. For another option to this playstyle, the Glamov set would also be good because it provides attack percentage and damage dealt. For her main stats, she's gonna want effect hit rate or crit stats for her chest, speed for her boots, quantum damage or attack percentage for her sphere, and ERR for her rope. For her substats, you're gonna want to prioritize getting effect hit rates, then speed, then crit stats, then attack percentage. For her Lightcones, Cypher's Lightcone will be her best because it increases her speed by 18%, which is crucial since she wants to be really fast, but it also allows her to decrease defense by an additional 24%, which will increase your team damage by around 30%. For another alternative, the Pearl's Lightcone would also be good because it allows her to reduce defense by 16%, which would result in around 17% more team damage. For another option, the Holiday Thermae Lightcone would also be good because it increases her damage dealt by 32%, which is good for sub DPS. It also applies a 16% vulnerability debuff, which is additive to her defense shred and resistance reduction, so it's actually a really good undiluted debuff. For another alternative, we finally have her signature, which is still good for her since it provides effect hit rates and crit stats, which is good for both her sub DPS and supportive capabilities, and it also implants a 12% vulnerability debuff, which again is actually pretty good. For another option, the Tutorial Icon would be good because it increases her effect hit rate by a significant amount and provides a good amount of energy, which is good for her required stats and ultimate uptime. Now for a more damage focused Overwolf, Acheron's Lycone would be her best, since it increases crit damage by 36% and increases her ultimate damage by 48%. For another option, the Good Night and Sleepwall icon would also be good, since it increases her damage dealt by 72%. For another option, the Boundless Choreo would also be good, because it increases her crit rate by 16% and crit damage dealt by 48%. For her teams, Silverwolf will really be good with characters that benefit off of debuff application and defense shred, so characters like Acheron and Archer are going to be incredibly powerful with her. Acheron is going to be really good with her, since Silverwolf will be fast enough to apply a ton of bugs onto the enemy. Not only that, but she'll be able to fulfill the Nihility teammate requirement in Acheron's passive, which will allow Acheron to do 115% of the original damage, which is actually massive scaling by the way, since it isn't a regular damage multiplier, but rather a 115% increase to the final damage done after the game already calculated her attack, damage multipliers, crit stats, and debuffs applied to the enemy. For Archer, Archer would benefit off of Silverwolf because he already gets a ton of buffs from his own kits and supports, so debuffs are really the only way you can amplify his damage without getting diminishing returns. And because Archer is typically paired up with Sparkle, Silverwolf can fulfill part of Sparkle's passive that wants to have a mono quantum team, and it'll help Sparkle increase all allies' attack, which is really good for Archer since attack percentage and crit rate are two of his most desired stats. Other than them, Silverwolf will also be really good with practically anybody else because of her insane defense shred and rush reduction being pretty universal amplifying effects, and she'll be incredibly good with other supports that also reduce defense shred, since defense shred provides accelerated returns. For her Eidolons, her E1 states that after using an ultimate to attack an enemy target, Silverwolf regenerates 7 energy for every debuff on the target up to 5 times. This Eidolon is actually insane for her ultimate usage and will allow her to focus on her sub DPS capabilities, since you'll be able to spam her ultimate. For her E2, it states that when an enemy target enters battle, she increases their damage taken by 20%, and when an enemy target gets attacked by ally targets, Silverwolf has a 100% base chance to implant one random bug on the attacked enemy target, which is really good since it provides a permanent 20% vulnerability debuff and it increases her bug application by a significant amount. For her E4, it states that after using her ultimate to attack an enemy target, she deals additional quantum damage equal to 20% of Silverwolf's attack for every debuff on the target up to 5 times, which is gonna be really good for sub DPS. For her E6, it states that for every debuff the enemy target has, the damage dealt by Silverwolf increases by 20%, up to a maximum increase of 100%, which is very similar to the previous Eidolon, except this time, instead of giving additional attacks that aren't affected by general damage bonuses, it instead amplifies her damage by 100% for her skill and her ultimate. For my pulling recommendations, I would recommend getting her E1, since it allows her to focus on her sub DPS, and it's just a big boost to her ultimate uptime as a support. Then I'd get her E2, since it's a permanent 20% vulnerability debuff and it increases her bug application by a significant amount. Then I wouldn't even get her S1, since even 4-star options are better for both her sub DPS and supportive capabilities. Now with all of that being said, should you summon on Silverwolf? Well, Silverwolf has a ton of defense shred that synergizes incredibly well with other defense shred sources from Relics, Lightcones, Eidolons, or teammates. Not only that, but she's the only character that can implant a weakness while also reducing that weakness type resistance, which gives her a ton of value. Still, it seems like she isn't as good as characters like Cypher, Trivy, or Robin, so if you do already have those characters, I would recommend skipping out on Silverwolf like Pella or Silverwolf that applies a ton of defense shred while also providing a ton more value. Anyways, that's all I've got for today. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you have anything to say, please leave it down in the comments below. I would greatly appreciate it. Goodbye.